Well, good evening and welcome to the Starting Point Project's live stream broadcast for October 2018. We're glad that you can join us. It's always an encouragement to us to know that you're out there. And we want you to know when the next broadcast is so you can put it on your calendar and tell others about it. It'll be Tuesday, November the 13th. That's the next one. Again, appreciate when you get the word out because we've got a lot of great content that we want others to be able to take advantage of. So get the word out with that. Mentioned the Grand Canyon a few times. I'm just pulling it up here again. This is a picture I took when I was there for the previous trip with my sister and brother-in-law. The next trip is going to be May 30th through June 2nd. We've already got 3 churches that seem interested in getting groups going. So if you are interested as an individual or a church, you want to get a hold of us soon to make sure that there's still room on that next trip. I also mentioned that this previous trip that we just did in August, my sister and brother-in-law stayed a little longer. We went to Antelope Canyon. It's a picture I took with my phone. It's just beautiful. A lot of extra things you can do before or after the trip if you want to extend it just a little bit. For those of you not that familiar with this show, you'll see just to the right of the screen where you're watching the video right now, there are some fields where you can type in a question and your name, and you can hit the button submit. We get it instantly, and at the end of the program, we'll be doing Q&A. There's also an email field. It's not required, but sometimes people submit some questions and we don't have time to get to all of them, and we don't have your contact information. So if you want us to be able to get a hold of you to respond, just send us your email address as well. And then if you scroll down on the screen, you'll see the archive area. That's where we put all the shows once they're done. So when tonight's show is finished, it'll eventually be on the archive, but you can also go to the archive to see the previous shows because there's a lot of great content there as well. I put this slide up as a reminder to myself to say hi to the Keatings, Doug and Sheila. I went to John Brown University with them in Arkansas. They're good friends of ours. Big encouragement to our family and to our ministry. They're great prayer warriors, and they're very much into apologetics and the creation message. And just talking to them recently because we're going to be scheduling an event there. I believe it's February. I keep forgetting February of next year. And I said, hey, I want to say hi to you during the program because they watch all the time. So I'm saying hi. I thought if I put the slide up, that way I won't forget. So again, we appreciate your support of the ministry, both prayer and financially, and just great friends. Looking forward to seeing you again soon. Our previous series, we're in the middle of a series right now, but we did a series prior to this. We did major issues with evolution. It was 4 parts. These were the pieces of information we covered, the information itself, origin and increase, where does information actually come from? We talked about natural selection and the Cambrian explosion, irreducible complexity and excluded middle complexity, and then also the origin of pink and blue, meaning male and female. So covered a lot of things in the previous series. Again, that's all in the archives if you want to take a look at that. Current series that we're doing is Icons of Evolution. This is going to be part 2 of 3. We did part 1 last month, part 2 now, and then part 3 will be in November. Icons of Evolution. What are icons? Icons are little graphic representations of a concept or an event or something. When you see the cross, you think about Christianity. When you see the scales there, you think of weighing justice. See the Statue of Liberty, you think about Ellis Island and people coming to our country. So these are just examples of icons, and we're going to be looking at icons that are related to the idea of evolution. Things you see and you think about evolution right away. We'll be going through a number of those. A little quick humor break here. We had one last month, probably have one next month as well. But this has to do with great moments in evolution. This is a Far Side cartoon. You can see there these fish swimming in the water. They have a baseball bat with them, and apparently they've hit the ball up onto land. So they needed to evolve lungs and legs to get up on the land to continue their game. So that kind of drove the idea of evolution. I think it's kind of humorous. And we're still in baseball season. I noticed up in the corner of the cartoon there, it says 1982. What's interesting about that is that's the last time the Milwaukee Brewers were in the playoffs and actually in the World Series. It was exciting for me being in Wisconsin here and being a Brewers fan, and the Brewers are in contention again. They're fact, playing right now as I'm doing this program, so I'm sacrificing not seeing the game. I'll have to check it afterwards. Also, good friend of ours now, Ron in California. He's submitted a lot of questions in previous programs. We want to make sure we get to a number of Ron's questions this evening because sometimes we run out of time. But Ron is from California. We weren't sure exactly where, but now we found out that he's actually living in the San Diego area now. But he's formerly from Wisconsin, and he's a Brewers fan and a Packers fan, so that's great. So we don't have to worry about him rooting for the Dodgers, which is who the Brewers are playing right now. But we appreciate you sending all those questions in. Jonathan Wells, a great author. He wrote the book Icons of Evolution and also a newer one, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. I've actually got the book with me right here. I've been gleaning some information from these books and putting it into the content of these shows, so I would recommend picking up the book if you're interested in getting a little more detail because we're just scratching the surface with these programs that we're doing. Also, a quote, this is incredible irony. This is a Chinese paleontologist. He's an evolutionist, but he said something that was very interesting. He said, in China, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin. And that's what we see. I mean, we got people burning flags and trashing the president and all that, and say or do seemingly whatever they want, but you don't dare speak disparagingly about Darwin or evolution. I mean, if you're a professor or a scientist and say anything that's doubtful of evolution, you probably lose your job, can't teach anymore, they won't publish your research. So you can criticize the government, but not Darwin, which is the opposite of what we see in communist China. Now, with this evening's program, what we covered last month in part one, we talked about Darwin's tree of life, how the single cell diversified into every other life form that we have. We looked at the Miller-Urey experiment, where in 1953 they were trying to simulate what they thought the atmosphere was like almost 4 billion years ago to see if they could try to figure out how life got its start. We talked about the peppered moths, these different colored moths that seem to change color over time. Is that evidence for evolution? No, they didn't really change color specifically, and it's really not evidence for evolution. We covered that one. And then the fossil horses, that's a great icon. People are used to seeing that little Eohippus and all the other fossils all the way up to modern horses. We showed how that really isn't evidence for evolution either. Part two, that's tonight, we're going to look at something called Haeckel's Embryos, Archaeopteryx, an interesting bird, Homology and vertebrate limbs. I'll explain that when we get there. And then we have Darwin's Finches, which most people have seen those pictures. And next month will be part three. And what we'll cover then is the whole ape to human progression. That's probably the most classic icon of evolution, the ape-like creature standing more upright into modern man. Then we'll look at bacterial resistance to antibiotics, whale evolution, and then finally something called vestigial organs, again, supposed evidence for evolution. But tonight we're doing part two. So we're going to be looking at these 4 elements here that I just mentioned. We're going to jump right in with number 5, which is the first one for tonight, which is Haeckel's Embryos. Some of you are familiar with, some aren't, but we'll be discussing it in a fair amount of detail here. Charles Darwin said something interesting related to these embryos. He considered embryology, the study of the development of embryos, to be by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of evolution. So in his mind, this was probably the most powerful evidence for this idea that he's purporting in the origin of species. Then we have Ernst Haeckel, Haeckel's Embryos. He was a German biologist, a contemporary of Charles Darwin. He made very popular this phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And you'll think, oh, of course it does. Or you might be thinking, what in the world does that mean? Well, let's take a look at each one of these words one at a time. We have ontogeny. That has to do with the development of the individual, whether it's a person, a plant, or an animal. Recapitulates, it means repeats or mimics. So the development of an individual mimics or repeats phylogeny, which is the entirety of evolutionary theory. So what they're saying is the development of an individual, whether it's a baby or plant or whatever, as it develops as an individual, it kind of reenacts all of evolution, a single-celled organism, then diversifying into all these other forms of life. That's kind of the idea behind that concept. Now, here are the drawings of embryos that we got from Ernst Haeckel. You'll see a number of animals up there from left to right. We have fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, pig, calf, rabbit, and human. And as you look at the diagram, let's say off to the left, those are embryos of fish. So from top to bottom on the left side, we have the development of a fish in earlier stages, middle stages, and then latter stages for each of those, top to bottom. And you can see that these embryos look fairly similar, and that was his point. They have all evolved from a common ancestor, and they all kind of mimic evolution as a whole as they develop as individuals. So let's focus in on just two of these, the pig and the human. As they develop from top to bottom, they look very, very similar. Again, that's because they have evolved from a common ancestor. Very powerful evidence for evolution. Well, getting back to his drawings, these embryos across the top of these different animals, those were his drawings. Well, today we don't just have drawings, we actually have photographs. Well, here are the actual photographs of these embryos, so you can compare top to bottom the drawing of the embryo from Haeckel and the actual photograph. The photographs show these embryos are not similar, nowhere near what his drawings were, and it turns out that he forged his drawings. He wanted them to be evidence for evolution. Even though they actually weren't, he kind of manipulated them to give powerful visual evidence for the concept of evolution. Now here's kind of a visual exercise. When you look at this picture here, I'm covering up the right side. You get an impression of what these objects might be, but as I move that rectangle to cover up a different portion, you get a totally different idea what it is. And we kind of go back and forth. Depending upon what area you see, you get a different picture of what this thing might be. It's kind of confusing optical illusion. So I move the rectangle in the middle, and maybe it's even more confusing now. What in the world is this thing? You take the rectangle away and you realize, okay, this is an optical illusion. It's kind of a fun object. But the point is, depending upon which portion you see, you get a different impression. You show one thing, you get this impression. You show something else, you get a different impression. That's kind of what Haeckel did with his drawings. He showed different stages of the embryos and forged the drawings to give the idea that evolution's a proven thing of science. We've got so much evidence here. Now I've got one more optical illusion here. You got these diagonal bands going across the screen. I'm going to put a horizontal line at the bottom here. I'm going to bring that line up to these bands that are on an angle. And what you see is that they're really not on an angle. They're perfectly horizontal. I'm going to continue to move this line to each segment there, and you'll see they're each perfectly horizontal. Even though your mind's playing tricks on you, they look like they're on an angle even when they're not. Now, what does that have to do with evolution? Yeah, probably nothing. It's just a cool optical illusion that I wanted to throw in here because I enjoy it. So let's continue on here with Haeckel's embryos. Here's a quote from Michael Richardson. He's a British developmental biologist. He's an evolutionist. He said, "It looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology." So he's admitting, yes, it was a fake. This is not really legitimate evidence for evolution, but it's still in current textbooks. Even though it was found out in Darwin's time that these things were fraudulently drawn, and now we even have the photographs that we know even better. They're not legitimate evidence, but it's still in the textbooks. Here's a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. He was one of the world's leading evolutionists, died I think in about 2007 or so. He's from Harvard University. He said, "We do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not the majority, of modern textbooks." So we see that Haeckel's embryos are not evidence for evolution. They were forged a long time ago during Darwin's time, but they're continued to use in textbooks today, even though the leading scientists know this is not legitimate evidence for evolution. Example number 2, Archaeopteryx. This is number 6 on the line of 12 that we're going through in these series. You've probably no doubt seen the pictures of Archaeopteryx here, this fossil here. It's in all the major museums. Here's what they envision Archaeopteryx probably actually looked like. Very interesting creature here. And here are a few of the details. It was first discovered in Bavaria in 1861. Bavaria is part of Germany. I put a map up there because if you were like me, and I know I am, I was geographically challenged growing up, didn't know where everything was. So this is basically in Germany. It was discovered in 1861. That's about 2 years after Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, when he popularized the idea of evolution. So he writes The Origin of Species, purporting how he thinks evolution worked, and then they discover a fossil, and so they just jumped on this thing to say, see, this is evidence of evolution. It's a transitional form, they say. The name comes from 2 Greek words, archaeos, which means ancient, and then pteryx, meaning feather or wing, so it's ancient feather or wing. It's about the size of a crow, so it wasn't this massive bird or pterodactyl or anything. It was about the size of a crow. And they claimed that it was about 153 million years old. We've talked about dating techniques and age of the earth in previous series, so I'm not going to go over that. I don't really buy into where they come up with these dates. I don't think it's very scientific, but according to the system they use, they claimed that it was around about 153 million years ago. And it did have some interesting features. It had feathers and wings like most birds. It had claws on the end of its wings, and then teeth and a bony tail. That's very interesting. So that kind of gave them the idea that maybe this thing is a transitional form, but we'll look into this a little bit further. Here's the history. They first initially claimed that it was a missing link between reptiles and birds. Because they look at birds today and they try to figure out where in the world did these things come from. Well, maybe reptiles, they envision, slowly turned into birds over millions of years. And so Archaeopteryx was this missing link in between reptiles and birds. But then they reclassified it as the oldest bird because they could tell this thing is really not transitional, but it's fully formed bird, but it's the oldest bird. That's what they claimed. Then they reclassified and promoted it to a bird-like flying dinosaur. Really a flying dinosaur. Why is that? Well, scientists today, the majority of them believe that dinosaurs evolved into birds. So I'm going to steal a few slides from a new series that we've just recorded on dinosaurs in the Bible. That'll be produced in DVD form pretty soon. UC Berkeley said dinosaurs are not extinct, technically. Based on features of skeletons, most people studying dinosaurs consider birds to be dinosaurs. They're serious about that. They go on to say, this shocking realization makes even the smallest hummingbird a legitimate dinosaur. So yes, even a hummingbird is a dinosaur. Well, as I was putting this series together, I was running a little bit behind because I made a mistake a couple weeks ago of just kind of browsing through a dictionary. Sometimes you do that looking for new words to expand your vocabulary, and I found one I hadn't seen before. I think it was called vacation. And I read the definition and it sounded fascinating, so I decided I would try it out. So my wife and I took off just for a couple days and an extended weekend, and when I got back, I realized how behind I was, so I was scrambling to put this together in time, and I wanted to, at this point, put a picture of a hummingbird feeder up there with a steak inside. A little bit of humor there, but didn't have time. Maybe I saved you the pain of having to roll your eyes there. But there are some problems with Archaeopteryx being evidence for evolution. Number one, fossils of birds have been found in lower layers, meaning according to evolutionary concepts, lower layers are much older. So fully formed birds existed before we found Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx couldn't be on its way to evolving into a bird because birds already existed. Secondly, fossils of alleged ancestors of feathered dinosaurs are actually dated much younger. Well, how could you have those things be younger than Archaeopteryx if they're ancestors? It really doesn't line up at all. And then these features are what we call mosaics. They're not transitional. They are fully formed feathers, fully formed teeth, fully formed claws. They're not on their way to becoming teeth or becoming claws or becoming feathers. They're mosaics. They're fully formed features that we see in different creatures. So it's not really qualifying as a transitional form. Plus, there are huge problems with morphing reptiles into birds. Just two very quickly here. Lung transformation. How do you get the lungs of a reptile to turn into the lungs of a bird, avian lungs? We're not going to look at this diagram in any detail here, but you cannot take a bellows type lung that reptiles would have and slowly, by making random changes in your DNA, turn it into an avian lung. It can't happen through mutations. And how would it survive in the middle when the bellows aren't really working anymore, but the bird's lungs don't work yet either? You can't do it step by step. So that's a huge problem. We can do a whole series just on that. And then how do you transform scales of reptiles into feathers of birds? You can use your imagination, but you can't cut it genetically. Feathers are very, very complex. We take them for granted, or they might be beautiful, but they're very complex systems of barbs and hooks that work together to give birds their flight and all that. We could do a series just on that, but you can't transform step by step through mutations, scales turning into feathers. And we don't have fossils of skethers, something that's kind of half scale, half feather. We have fully formed scales and fully formed feathers and nothing in between. Here's a quote from Alan Fiducia. He's one of the world's leading experts on birds. He's an evolutionist. He said, paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that. So here's an evolutionist himself, a world's leading expert on birds, saying Archaeopteryx is a bird. He's not a transition, he's not a dinosaur, he's a fully formed bird. So we can see that Archaeopteryx just doesn't cut it as evidence for evolution, even though it's a very popular icon and it continues to be in textbooks. Third one for this evening, number 7 out of 12, the idea of homology, specifically homology in vertebrate limbs. There are 4 examples of limbs in vertebrates here. The first one on the right is the vertebrate limb of the bat. You can see 5 digits there. Then we have the vertebrate limb of the whale there and its fin. There are actually 5 there. There's some shorter ones there, but there are 5 total. Then you've got the horse hoof and the end of its leg there. There are 5 bones there. And then the human hand, 5 digits. They call it the pentadactyl features here. Why is this? Well, of course, they've all evolved from a common ancestor. This is evidence or proof of evolution. That's how it's pitched. That's how this evidence is shown in the textbooks. Well, it's interesting, long story, I got to make this one short. I was invited to a Christian university to debate another scientist on the idea of creation evolution. They wanted me to come in and give evidence for the Genesis creation account, and they were going to bring in an evolutionist to give evidence for evolution. And I was wondering who they were going to get, and I thought, you know what, probably going to get one of their own professors, because that's very common today at Christian universities to be promoting evolution. And that was the case in this instance. They brought their PhD biology professor to defend evolution. Very fascinating story. I have to skip the details for now, other than in his entire presentation, he had one graphic of scientific evidence for evolution, and it was this picture here, this diagram of homology. He said, see the similarities here? This is a proof they've evolved from a common ancestor. Evidence for evolution. This is actually one of the weakest evidences for evolution. It doesn't count for a number of reasons that we'll cover here, but it's interesting that he had a limited amount of time, and that's what he chose to convey in his debate. Well, here's an old biology textbook, and the picture there on the left has nothing to do with this textbook. I couldn't find a picture of it, so I just put an old biology textbook in there, but this is a brief course in biology from 1926. This is when they were talking about homology, and they said, the obvious answer is, meaning why are these structures similar, is that they all descended from the same ancestors. Biologists carry this answer a step further and say that since homology within species is a result of common ancestry, therefore all homology is due to common ancestry, and the closeness of relationship determines the number of homologous parts. What are they saying? Well, within species of a given animal, they've got similar features that you see because they're this, similar species and they've come from a common ancestor, and they're going to expand that to all living things. So any living thing that has homology, similar structures, is because they have all evolved from a common ancestor and ultimately starting from a single cell, maybe 3.8 billion years ago. That's how they feel about homology. Well, here's a quote from David Wake, University of California, Berkeley. He said, common ancestry is all there is to homology. Homology is common ancestry. That's what it means. Well, if homology is common ancestry, then you can't use homology to prove common ancestry because you're saying it's the same thing. So what are they conveying? Okay, these two structures are similar because they had a common ancestor. How do we know they had a common ancestor? Because they have similar structures. It's circular reasoning here, very plain, and some scientists have actually admitted that when it comes to the idea of homology. Here's an interesting analogy from Tim Berra, professor of Ohio State University. He said if you look at a 1953 Corvette and compare it to the latest model, only the most general resemblances are evident. But if you compare a 1953 and a 1954 Corvette side by side, then a 54 and a 1955 model and so on, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. This is what paleontologists do with the fossils, and the evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people. You're crazy if you deny this. Well, here was a diagram that he used. You've got the Corvettes there from starting at 53 on up through 78. You know, look at how similar they are. You can see descent with modification. There are just slight changes as they developed over the years. Well, this came back to haunt him. They called it Berra's blunder because in this analogy that he used, these cars were designed each time. And the reason they have similarities is twofold. Number one, they need to accomplish similar things, so they're going to have similar functions, similar design. Plus, they had a common designer, so you're going to see that throughout these models. Fits in perfectly with the creation narrative that there's a common designer for all of life, and certain things needed to carry out certain functions, so there's going to be commonality there as well. So this is really kind of a mistake for him to bring that analogy up. But there are other problems with this as well. The problem of unrelated developmental paths. What do I mean by that? We have Darwin's, tree of life here. We've talked about this one in previous programs. You have a single-celled organism that copies itself and eventually diversifies into all the various life forms that we have today. Well, here's the problem. We've got insects and birds in the rectangles. That's where they appear on these trees. They didn't have the exact same path. They don't have direct common ancestors. Yet they both have wings that carry out the functions of flying. But it wasn't because they had a common ancestor. They just kind of developed those independently. So you can't say because these things have similar structures, they obviously had a common ancestor, because in these cases they didn't have a direct common ancestor. They just kind of developed independently. So you can't use that as evidence if you're going to say, well, it's not always evidence. So here we have the bee there and the bird both having wings. So these aren't homologous structures because of common ancestry. They're calling them analogous structures. They just kind of made up another word to saying, yes, they have similar structures here, but it's not because they have a common ancestor. They just have a similar function and they just kind of happen to develop that way. There are also some genetic issues with this concept of homology, similar structures, and here's what it looks like. We've got the human arm there with the 5 digits in its hand, and then the bat wing there, 5 digits as well. If these two life forms had a common ancestor that had genetic information to make 5 digits, it would have copied those genes and given them to both, the human and the bat. So that gene would be copied. So it would be the same gene in the human and the bat that creates the 5 digits. But we often see that it's not the same segment on the DNA that produces these features. Sometimes it's completely different genes that makes the same feature. So that's the opposite of what they're purporting. That's a problem for them. So what do? You just make up new words. Homeoplasy, that's where you do have similar structures, but it didn't come from a common ancestor. It just kind of coincidentally came from separate genes, not a common ancestor. They also call this concept convergence. What does that mean? You had two separate things. They did not come from a common ancestor. They came from separate ancestors, but they just kind of converged on the same plan here. Just coincidentally happened to give you the same design. But again, it was a coincidence. It wasn't because of the genetic information in those genes. As an example, we have a wombat and a marmot. These two creatures look very similar. They're actually very similar in real life, but they have completely different reproductive systems. The wombat is a marsupial, carries its young in a pouch. The marmot is placental, like human beings. It develops in the placenta. Completely different reproductive systems. So they obviously didn't come from a direct descendant, an ancestor that produce them both because they have different reproductive systems. So how is it that they came from two separate places but evolved almost identical and everything else? They look the same. Oh, it's just a coincidence. They happen to converge on the same thing coming from two different directions, different genetics. Well, that doesn't make any sense genetically. They're just kind of winging it and making up new names when things aren't consistent. One of my favorite quotes comes from Jonathan Wells. I mentioned him in the beginning, wrote the two books that I referred to. He said this: apparently similarity is evidence of common ancestor, except when it isn't. And so they want to say similarity proves common ancestor. Oh, but these similarities, they don't. So either way, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Another quote from Richard Milton, a British journalist and evolutionist. He said, "It is homology that Darwinists rely on to bridge the gaps in the fossil record. It is homology that underlies the diagrams drawn up by Darwinists from Haeckel to the present day, showing how every living thing is related. Ultimately, however, it is homology that has provided the greatest stumbling block to Darwinian theory. For that, at the final and the most crucial hurdle, homology has fallen." And so what we see is the similarity in these structures and other homologous things and living things, they do not present evidence for evolution. It's actually a big problem, but it persists in the textbooks even to the present day. Our last example, number 8, Darwin's finches. Everyone's probably inevitably seen pictures of these different finches, specifically with different beaks on them, that is used in textbooks to promote the idea of evolution. And here's how the story goes. Once upon a time, Darwin took a trip on the Beagle, a ship, and he went to the Galapagos Islands. Here's a picture of those islands, and when he got there, he found different finches, and they had different types of beaks. And he thought, well, they have evolved these different types of beaks because of changes in their environment. It was so powerful that then he writes The Origin of Species in 1859, driven by what he had learned from these finches. Well, that's actually complete myth. Historians tell us, no, nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, he did find finches there, but he didn't connect that with the idea of evolution. Later scientists did, but it wasn't Darwin. But again, that's what the textbooks will say, that Darwin took his trip, he saw the finches, wrote The Origin of Species, and here's some of the best evidences for his idea. Well, the general idea with these finches is they're on these islands here, and they have different beaks, but then the climate can change, and maybe there's a drought, so things dry up and the seeds become very hard. Well, finches with the stronger, shorter beaks are better at getting the seeds open and eating them. The finches with smaller, weaker beaks, they'll probably die out. And so you tend to have more offspring from the beaks, from the finches with the stronger beaks. So eventually you see finches that typically have stronger beaks because of the change in climate. That's the idea behind the finches here. Some people have a false perception. They're thinking, well, you got all these finches here, and then the climate changes, and so the beaks change on the finch. The finch says, oh, I need to evolve this larger beak right now to survive. No, they're not thinking about doing that. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't try to all of a sudden have a larger beak. That's a common misconception. Now, the leading scientists don't believe it happened that way, but sometimes the common literature will give you the impression that a creature needed something, so all of a sudden it changed so it could survive. It's not about an individual changing, it's about a population surviving with environmental changes. So, more study has been done since Darwin's time on these finches, and they've discovered some interesting things. So again, here are the islands. Let's say there's one of them we'll call Island A and another one Island B. What they found is that they say different species of finches that have evolved over time. What they found is examples where species X and Y on Island A are more similar to each other than species X on Island A is to the finches on Island B, species X. So let me repeat that again. Two supposedly different species on the same island are more similar to each other than the same species that might be on different islands. Well, that shouldn't be if evolution is true. In fact, they shouldn't even be able to breed together, but what they found through studying is that there's a lot of interbreeding with the different species on these islands. Well, if they're different species, they shouldn't be able to breed together. That's kind of how they define a species groups of creatures that can't interbreed. But it looks genetically like all these species have been interbreeding over time. So it's not due to evolution because they are interbreeding. But the concept is still in the textbooks. And here's an example of biology. This is from 2014. It says, as a result, average beak size in this finch population has increased dramatically. Changes in food supply created selection pressure that caused finch populations to evolve within decades. So the changes in climate and all that in food supply drove evolution and caused them to change dramatically. That's what they're telling us in the textbook. What they failed to tell you is that when the drought ended, the increase in average beak size disappeared. It went back to normal again. So there's just fluctuations in beak sizes over time, but no net changes. And that's what a lot of leading scientists are admitting, that no, there's these limits here. It's really not upward evolution. It's just, small changes here and there back and forth, but they still have it in the textbooks as though it was powerful evidence for evolution. All we're really seeing here is what we call natural selection. We've talked about this in previous programs. Natural selection is not a powerful force. It doesn't do anything. It's a description of what we observe happening in nature. Those creatures that are suited well to their environment, they survive. Those that aren't suited well to changes, they die out. Natural selection explains the survival of the fittest, but it doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. How do we get new creatures to begin with? Natural selection absolutely cannot create anything new. It just works with what already exists and explains why some of them die out and some of them stick around. So natural selection is a fact of science, but it has nothing to do with turning a single-celled organism into other life forms over time. So Darwin's finches, we find out too, don't cut it. They're not evidence for evolution, but they will continue to be in the textbooks as though they were. So we looked at Haeckel's embryos, we looked at Archaeopteryx, we looked at homology invertebrate limbs, and then we looked at Darwin's finches, none of which provide evidence for evolution, but they are classic icons, supposedly providing strong evidence for the idea. Next month, we will cover the ape to human progression. We will take a look at antibiotic resistance in bacteria. We'll talk about whale evolution, and then we'll look at something called vestigial organ. Again, all purported evidences for evolution. And our next show again is November 13th. It's a Tuesday night. Put it on your calendar. We look forward to having you join us with that. We are now going to move into our Q&A session, which is my favorite time after a very, very brief break. So hang in there and we'll see you in just a minute. All right, we are back for our Q&A session. Again, my favorite part. We're going to go right to them. And on the screen, our first question is Ron in California, our good buddy Ron. He's submitted a lot of questions over time. I'm glad we're actually able to address some of these this evening. What do evolutionists propose as to how replication/reproduction serendipitously emerged alongside of first forms of life? I like this question for a few reasons. First and foremost, it uses the word serendipitously, and I like practicing saying that, and I've said it twice now without messing up. So, how do evolutionists say that life appeared with the ability at the same time magically to be able to reproduce itself? Well, I'm going to attack this from two different angles very briefly. Generally speaking, when evolutionists talk about the formation of life, it already includes the ability to reproduce. It's part of the definition of things that are technically alive, is that they not only take in food and metabolize things, but they have to be able to reproduce. So typically when they say life emerged 3.8 billion years ago from dead chemicals, it already had the ability to copy itself. If it didn't, it'd be a dead end. It couldn't evolve or anything. And so when they talk about these chemicals coming together to form amino acids, to maybe somehow make a protein and then somehow encase itself in a membrane and all that, then it also had the ability to reproduce itself. So many problems with that. They have so many challenges with figuring out how that happened. They don't have answers. But one of the chicken and the egg problems with that is for life to be possible here, it has to be able to replicate its DNA and copy and all that. Well, errors happen when DNA gets copied because there's so much information, and that's what we call mutations. There's actually an error correction system that checks out the copies and say, oh, look at all these mistakes, let's fix those. Occasionally a mistake makes it through that, and that's what we call a mutation. But if we didn't have that error correction system, life wouldn't be possible. But the information that produces that error correction system, that's encoded on the DNA. So how do you get DNA without the error correction system? But how do you have an error correction system without the DNA that produces that? It's a chicken and egg thing, crazy problem. They can't really even get life started. So they really, to this date, do not have answers how dead chemicals could come together and be alive and reproduce themselves. But they kind of tie all those together. The second angle of attacking this problem is somehow, even if they got dead chemicals to come alive and could reproduce itself, it's going to just make a copy of itself. And that's what they say happened. 3.8 billion years ago, a single cell was alive and it had the ability to make a copy of itself. So now you have another single-celled organism. And that copies itself and you have another single-celled organism. And it keeps going. At some point in evolutionary history, it needed to change from that, just copying itself, to making a pink and a blue one, a male and a female, where each has only half of the required genetic information, and they have to be able to get together in a transport system to merge the two pieces of information to then be able to reproduce. How is that possible? There are so many components that are going on in order for sexual reproduction to occur, a male and a female. You cannot evolve that one piece at a time, because if you don't have all the pieces the very first time, you can't reproduce. If you can't reproduce, you can't evolve. Not only that, but every time there's a new species, you have to have the pink and the blue working immediately, or it's a dead end. So this is a massive, massive problem for evolution. The main way they get around that is to say, oh, it's not our problem. We don't deal with that. We just deal with how one creature slowly changed into another one. But I always say, well, wait a minute, you got to get the process started. So you really do have to account for how life started and could replicate before you can start talking about how one creature changed into another one. So it's one of the probably 3 or 4 major problems that secular humanists and evolutionists have is how did all that occur if you just have particles smashing together in nature, if there's no creator, no designer? But great question. Next one, Silas from Wisconsin. He's in our studio audience here today. Do most teachers know that these icons are not valid? A great question. My answer is generally no. My experience is no, they're not aware that a lot of these things that they're teaching are not true. And I've made this point many times in the past. We need to keep that in mind and not think that all these teachers in the public school systems and professors in the state universities are awful, rotten, nasty liars. They're not trying to lie to anybody. They believe these things are true primarily because it's the only thing that they've ever heard, and they've heard that there's evidence for it. So they learn it in high school, they go off to college and learn even more. Some of them say, hey, I'd like to be a teacher because I loved my high school biology teacher and I liked biology, so I'm going to get a degree in teaching biology in high school. So they learn more about evolution. They go back to the high school, get the books out, and all those things are in the textbooks, and they teach it just like they learned it, not even being aware that a lot of these things have been disproven. A lot of the leading scientists realize that these things aren't true, but it doesn't tend to trickle down to the public school systems and to the textbooks. Sometimes they say, well, it's just expensive to change all the textbooks. Well, if those evidences aren't true, they really shouldn't be in there. So most teachers and professors aren't aware of these things not being true because it really hasn't made it that far to them. They're never allowed typically to hear the other side. So that's why personally I take it easy on them, because they don't necessarily even know better. But again, great question. Next question, Dave in Arkansas. Hey, Dave. I'm wondering, what is the best response when people bring up these icons? Another practical question here. When people bring them up, again, my experience, 32 years, is that they generally don't know a lot of the details behind them. They're just repeating what they've heard from other people. In fact, probably the majority of people who say they believe in evolution aren't really aware of any of the specific evidences. They just are under the impression that evolution's a fact and everyone believes it, all the smart people do, so they want to be smart too and say, sure, I believe it. But if you ask them for specific examples, they generally won't know. They'll do something that we talked about in the past called elephant hurling. You just throw these large statements out there like, well, evolution's an absolute fact. All scientists believe it. It's been proven by evidence from every area of science. Okay, could you give me a few examples? Well, there's tons of them. Okay, I'm looking for just a couple examples here. Well, there's whole books on it. Go get a book on it. Okay, so you believe that evolution is a fact because you think there's evidence and it's in books, but you yourself aren't familiar with the specific evidences, which is fine, but then you're really exercising a faith, and it's actually a blind faith because you don't know the specifics behind it. Occasionally you run into someone who does have some specifics. So if someone says, hey, here are evidences for evolution, first question you should ask, assuming that you might not know all the details behind these things, if you don't know, first and foremost, ask them, are these things that you're bringing up to me, are these some of the best evidences in your mind for evolution? If they say no, then say, okay, could we temporarily table those things, and could you tell me what the top maybe 3 evidences are? We'll deal with those. If they say, well, yeah, these things that I brought up, they really are some of the best evidences, say, okay, tell me a little bit more about it, maybe send me some links to some information so I can look into it because I'm not that familiar with them. Then you go and you find answers. You also want to ask them, if I can get back to you with some more information about these things that you brought up to show you that maybe they're not so solid and don't count or maybe have been completely discredited, if I could do that, would you be willing to hear more about God and the Bible and Jesus? If they say no, then they're really not looking for truth. If they say yes, your homework is cut out for you. You need to get a hold of our ministry. You can go to thestartingpointproject.com, shoot us an email. We can get you that information, or there are other ministries out there, or get some books or some of our resources or whatever, but get answers. And then get back to them very graciously and say, hey, I appreciate you taking the time the other day to share some of those evidences with me. I wasn't that familiar with them, but I was curious, so I did some research, and I found some things that were really fascinating. But I'd love to get your feedback because you seem to really be into this. So here are the sources. When you do that, then the onus is on them to be willing to hear more about Jesus and Christianity and the Bible. If not, then they're lacking a little bit of credibility there. But again, you want to do this very graciously because it's not about winning arguments or just throwing facts out there. It's about being patient with them as they're maybe struggling with some of these things too. But that's just my suggested approach with these icons if someone happens to bring them up. But great question. Jerry in Texas. Hey, Jerry. Is the finch natural selection similar to the moth natural selection last month? In a sense, it really is. What we see in both cases is there's really nothing new there. With the moths, we initially had light and dark colored moths. After the changes in the Industrial Revolution, pollution goes up into the atmosphere and some of those fungal growths die off on the trees. There were changes in the environment. We went from having light and dark colored moths to having light and dark colored moths. And you didn't even have one that evolved into the other. You just had more of one and then later more of the other. With the finches, on these islands, you have finches with different types of beaks. There's genetic information to make different types of beaks. So before and after, at one point and then later, you've got more of one and less of the other. And then you have the opposite other times. It's just a very fluctuation, variations back and forth with existing genetic information. It's not like they were growing something completely new out of nowhere because they needed it or because something in the environment changed. It's just the built-in genetic variability being triggered by changes in the environment. Quick analogy that I shared before, when the temperature drops outside, does that create a thermostat and a furnace in your home? Obviously not. You already have a thermostat and a furnace in your home that are designed to detect changes in the environment. It says, hey, it's getting colder out there. I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to turn the furnace on. So it sends a signal to the furnace, fires up, and you got hot air blowing through the house. The change in the environment didn't create those things. Those things were designed to detect the changes and adjust accordingly. Same thing with creatures that God designed. They're designed to detect changes in their environment so that they can survive when those changes occur. If they can't, they die out, they become extinct. But God built this variability into all these creatures to be able to adjust to different environmental conditions. So it's a great point to bring up. Very parallel analogies here with the peppered moth last month and then the finch beaks for this month. So great question. Back to Ron again. Do you think advancements in DNA extraction from fossils help to resolve the evolution creation debate? Great question. Backdrop of that very quickly is we've been discovering more and more biological material in fossils where we weren't expecting to see that, or I should say evolutionists weren't expecting to see that. These fossils, they say, are very old. They wouldn't think that biological materials would last that long, but we have been discovering carbon-14 in dinosaur fossils, which that should decay away so quickly. It should be gone after a few tens of thousands of years, but they say these bones are 65 or 100 million years old. Still has carbon-14 in it. But not only that, now we are finding biological material in there with soft tissue, red blood cells, and now even DNA. Those things should not be there. There's no way they're going to last that long. They are starting to look for those things more often now, having found them before. They weren't looking before, they thought it can't be there. Now that we're seeing it, they're proactively looking for it. So, two things with that. One, it's showing to me very strong evidence these bones can't be millions of years old because those materials can't last that long. And secondly, when we're looking at the genetic information, we're seeing a lack of the changes that we would expect if evolution were true. One example I've maybe used in a previous program, some bacteria that were revived from, I think there were salt inclusions that are supposed to be like maybe 450 million years old. The bacteria were not only revived, when they looked at the DNA, it seemed almost identical to modern bacteria. So not only is it still around, but it hasn't changed in 450 million years of evolution. To me, that's evidence that it's not that old. Most likely it was buried during the flood about 4,500 years ago, and it's still around today because it's not that old, and it hasn't changed because it's not evolving. So I think it is providing powerful evidence for the creation narrative, but it's going counterintuitively and antithetical to an evolutionary scenario. Now, they're never going to say, wow, that's powerful. I guess we were wrong. We should all become creationists and go worship Jesus. What they will want to do is come up with rescuing devices, some way to explain it away. So I know this looks bad, but we can still handle it somehow. Typically, it's hush-hush for a long time because they don't have good answers. So they just don't even talk about it. You won't see it on the cover of Time magazine. Eventually, when they come up with something that they think is somewhat plausible, then they say, well, of course, we've discovered this. Everyone knows that, but it's not a problem, and here's why. Usually when they share what their solution is, it's really a stretch, and it's not a good answer to why we're seeing these things. But I think the more we discover, the more it's going to confirm the Genesis creation account, but go against these ideas that we've been taught about evolution. So our next broadcast, we're to the end of today's program. November 13th, Tuesday, we're going to be covering the last 4 icons of evolution. We hope that this has been helpful to you, illuminating and help you understand the creation-evolution controversy and why you're seeing what you're seeing in the textbooks. But again, these are not weapons to go use to win arguments. These are primarily intended to strengthen your faith in the authority of God's Word so that you can go out more boldly and share the gospel message with a lost and dying world. This is largely a spiritual issue we're dealing with and not just an academic debate. We want to be very gracious as we're sharing these things with those around us. So thanks for joining us again for this month. We look forward to seeing you in November. God bless.